Mark Monfort is the founder of data consultancy New Era Analytics and has spent over a decade working with data. He has a background in finance, working in equity research, both in Australia and in the UK, and spent some time at the ASX. Last year, he created ETFtracker, an Australian-focused ETF research and interactive analysis platform. He uses all of this to create market updates, and you can see his work on AusBiz and Livewire markets. Welcome, Mark.
Thanks for having me, Rachel. Great to be here.
Well, we've got a few questions for you today, Mark, and the first one being, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So apart from that great intro, my world is all about data, and I've been always interested in financial markets. I was very lucky to come across a startup that was in that space and was actually run by the former head of equities at a big bank here in Sydney. And we met in Melbourne and we started a bit of a business together. And then that got joined with an investment bank overseas. And I got to travel the world thanks to data and thanks to finance. And currently I'm trying to do as much as I can, apart from the day job where I consult to various corporates and government entities on the world of data. I try to help out retail investors. So I kind of feel like, well, we've all got things that we can help with, charities and whatnot. But for me, it's my time and, after hours helping retail investors with understanding the world of ETFs.
And can you tell us the difference between an active and passive ETF?
Yeah, sure. So out of all of the different ETFs that are in the marketplace, a lot of people think that it's just passive. They just track an index. Often they're called, I'll just invest in an index, when in actuality, the indexes are the things that the ETFs oftentimes will track. The majority of them are passive, meaning that they are just there to track the benchmark. If the benchmark, being the index, does poorly, it's going to stay, it's going to go negative, that ETF, or if it does well, the index, it's going to track it. It's not meant to outperform, it is just meant to follow. And active ETFs are built to have that ability to outperform. And what that means is that they don't have to track the benchmark. So you've got that pro that they can outperform the benchmark. But what we do find is that active management of anything, whether it's just equities or ETFs or futures, is very hard. And so whilst you do have that ability to outperform with active, it doesn't mean that they always do. So there's a bit of pros and cons with both of them, but that's often the case that people, just don't realize that there are these active ETFs. There's about 40 to 50 of those on the ASX and Chi-X, but that list is growing.
Do you have any thoughts on international ETFs?
Yeah, I do. I think that here in Australia, people often think, especially when they're just getting started, that people say, hey, you should invest in some ETFs. Oh, what's available in Australia? That it's only Australian ETFs. But the managers, many of them have global ETFs. And so they're still ASX or Chi-X listed, but they do invest in stocks and equities and even bonds that are overseas focused. So you can buy into the NASDAQ or the S&P 500 or Euro stocks or Asian stocks or themes that are basically global in nature. So it doesn't just have to be a market that you're buying into. And the advantage is that because you're buying something that is Australian listed, there's less paperwork that you would need to fill in, as opposed to, say, buying something that is a ETF in the US. So if you were to buy ARK Invest type ETFs, buying that on, depending on the platform, you might need to fill in extra paperwork. But some platforms, for example, Stake, they'll take care of the W8BEN form, W8BEN, which is what the US requires you to fill in so that you don't get taxed that twice. And that's something that investors should consider. But the good thing about Australian ETFs that are listed on Chi-X and the ASX is that you can actually get that overseas exposure from your very home.
What's the biggest lesson you have for investors in ETFs?
So the biggest lesson that I would have, and it's something that I like because I hear other people saying it as well, and that is look under the hood. So ETFs, you might see the label, it says it's ESG this, or it's a cybersecurity ETF, or it's a robotics ETF. You need to look under the hood, because unless you do that, you might not see how it has been trending in terms of various statistics, not just pricing statistics, there's more to it, but you also might not know that there could be companies in there that you don't necessarily want as part of your ETF, because maybe you already have them in other ETFs that you've got, or maybe you've already invested in those companies, so you don't necessarily want to double up too much. But unless you look under the hood, you won't know this kind of information. And I've found that sometimes people will just blindly buy ETFs just based on what the label says, what's the name on the tin. It's not that hard to look underneath the hood to see what's there. But yeah, the biggest lesson is to look under the hood, because depending on what you find and what you care about, you'll find that you probably want to dig a little bit further on whatever that is, but you have to start with looking under the hood.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Very important to look under the hood. So we've got a few more questions for you. Can you give examples of where you've looked at ETFs and found strong similarities?
Yeah, so apart from, so people will suspect if an ETF is tracking similar things, that rightly so, it should have similar holdings. So things like STW or IOZ or A200, which are all tracking the ASX 200, 300 type indices. But oftentimes people won't realize that something could be quite similar in a name of an ETF that you don't think, should be, or maybe you just don't worry about whether or not it's tracking something, but you should have a look at how crossover there is with the ETFs that you've got. Because, for example, in Australia, we've got FAIR from BetaShares, which is an ethically produced and created and managed ETF. So it follows those ESG principles, but it's got a lot of similarities with those major like ASX 200, so A200, STW, IOZ, because it's basically a subset of those names with a few more, and it focuses on the ones that are ESG focused. But sometimes people don't really realize that, and it's like, well, maybe you should just buy one or the other. The same thing can be said for like ETHI and say NDQ in the US, but we also see similarities across groups of names, such as in the property space, for example. So whether it's Australian property or global property type ETFs, there's only a few of those, but you might like the property kind of play and buy a few of them. The thing is, they're going to be holding very similar names. So people just need to be aware of that. And as we said about looking under the hood, you find this out when you do look under the hood.
Can you give examples of what else you can do by analysing ETF holdings?
Yeah, sure. So some of the other things that you can do, it's not just to pull two ETFs together and see how similar they are in terms of their top holdings, but other things that you can do, you can actually reverse the search. So say, for example, you want to see if you're interested in a particular company, what are the ETFs that company, like let's say it's Facebook or Amazon or Kogan, what ETFs is that in? What does it have exposure to? So there's various tools out there that can do that. We can do some of that with ETFtracker. So we cover the majority of the ASX 200. Sorry, we cover the majority of the ASX listed ETFs and some of the Chi-X ones as well, where you can type in names like Afterpay and Kogan, and it could be big or small companies, and we'll give you a list of like what ETFs they're in. And that's important because sometimes people want to start from that perspective. They don't think about the ETF necessarily. They know they're interested in a certain couple of companies and they want to see which ETFs they can look at. So those are some of the things that people can do, but you can also run your portfolio through a holdings analysis kind of tool. So we do that for these ASX and Chi-X ETFs, but there's also tools overseas, some paid for and some also somewhat free. So there's like ETF database, there's Track Insight, there's some of these other ones where you can put in names and you can see if your portfolio, how much crossover there is. And so we do that for free at ETFtracker as well. But as I said, it's only for the ASX and Chi-X. It's only for the Aussie ETFs. But those are some of the things that you can do when you're looking at ETF holdings analysis.
Thank you, Mark, very much for the information around ETFs. We have our virtual investment forum coming up, which focuses on ETFs for one day. And we look forward to you being able to watch it virtually.
Perfect. I look forward to being there and seeing all the great insights that you'll have.
Great. Thank you.